Presentation on hearing impairment, which is the category from the IDEA bill that I chose to cover in my presentation today. So the definition of hearing impairment, according to the bill, according to the IDEA bill, is hearing impairment means an impairment in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, that adversely affects a child's educational performance, but that is not included under the definition of deafness in this section. And so, in contrast to deafness, oftentimes this will denote a level of hearing ability that is less than normal levels for the average person. However, it's not quite to the level of hearing impairment that would be considered deafness. So the characteristics of people with these the characteristics of people with this impairment, with this disability, really is just the inability to hear sounds at a certain decibel level or below. So, for example, an average person would detect very tiny amounts of sound or no sound at all at 0 decibels. However, for someone with a hearing impairment, depending on the severity of that hearing impairment, that threshold is taken up to however many decibels it takes for the person to barely hear anything coming through. And due to this, students with a hearing impairment would likely have trouble communicating orally, just due to a lack of ability to develop proper speech patterns because to those speech patterns. So the prevalence of hearing impairment is difficult to estimate, mostly due to differences in definition. It also has to do with populations that are studied. However, generally, the United States Department of Education estimates around 0.10% of students between the ages of 16 and 21 would be considered deaf or hard of hearing. And notice that the difference in that number is that there really is not a separation between deafness and a hearing impairment. And so it's very difficult to truly get a lock on a number that would be considered a percentage for children that are simply hearing impaired rather than all the way to the level of deafness. Now, among those, 30% of these students come from Spanish-speaking homes, which is frankly an interesting metric, and also one of the reasons why for resources that I went to find for this disability, I found them in Spanish because I feel like it's such a prevalent issue among households that speak that language that it's important to find those in that language. So identification methods that people have to identifications that doctors that doctors and educators can use to identify those with hearing impairment include screening tests, pure tone audiometry, and speech audiometry. So with a screening tests are generally done within days of a new baby's birth. So what these screening tests measure are otoacoustic emissions, which are very low frequency emissions coming from the cochlea rather than just being received by it. And seeing the level of these emissions helps the doctor to understand how well the cochlea is working. And so you can have a pretty good benchmark on whether or not the child is going to experience any hearing impairment through that. When my son was born just a couple of months ago, this was one of the tests that they put him through. And so what generally happens is they'll put a small little earphone over their ear, and that will just simply That will simply measure the response from that from the cochlea over a period of time. Usually takes about 30 seconds to a minute to run. What we also have is pure tone audiometry, which really just tests decibel levels of detection by a child. And so pure tone audiometry uses to provide the sound that needs to be detected by the child. They use pure tones of very specific frequencies. So for example, as I said previously, an average person would barely hear a sound at 0 decibels. And so, in order to identify level of hearing impairment, a tester for pure tone audiometry would use a specific frequency. However, they would play it at different decibel levels so that the child could identify when they actually are able to hear, when the child is actually able to hear the sound. And now speech audiometry is a very similar test. However, instead of just using pure tones at a frequency generated by a machine, this actually tests decibel levels of speech. So they play speech into the child's ear at different decibel levels to see when it is that the child can detect and understand that speech. So educational strategies that teachers can use for students who are hearing impaired. There's actually been quite a bit of debate on the most effective form of form of teaching and education for these students. And so that really big debate is a debate between oralism versus manualism. So oralism focuses much more things that the child may be able to hear if they're hearing impaired and can still detect sound at a certain decibel level. So oralism focuses a whole lot more on amplifiers as well as speech reading. And then manualism focuses more on physical cues that a teacher can use to communicate with a child that include sign language, either English signing or American Sign Language, to help the child to communicate. So the methods of oral, you know, oral-based communication for these are, first of all, auditory verbal strategies, which use primarily amplifiers, and they focus and rely on the fact that most children with hearing loss still have a little bit of residual hearing that they can use. And so by using amplifiers or microphones or anything like that, the teacher can still speak to the student instead of having to show them visually what they mean. Now, auditory oral kind of takes that a step further and introduces speech reading, which is the proper term for what we would call lip reading. But speech reading not only focuses on the child reading the lips of the person that is speaking to them, but also their visual cues, their emotions, and everything like that. And that's still kind of focusing on the idea that that can be combined with the residual hearing in a child to be able to communicate. And then also there is total communication, which is it's kind of a mix between oralism and manualism, which involves simultaneously speaking and signing instructions to your class. So oftentimes that will use so oftentimes this total communication will use a different kind of manual communication that is it's I'm sorry. Um, so total communication uses a different form of sign language, so to speak, to speak. So this is simply this is just simply an English system of signing, which doesn't change order of words and can be done simultaneously with English speech because it matches up perfectly with the words and sentence structure, thereby giving thereby giving students the ability to hear and see, or to try and hear and see both simultaneously. Other advocates say that really sign language, American Sign Language, should be used and is considered the natural language of people who are deaf and should be used to communicate with them, even though use of that is much more difficult for use of that is much more difficult for teachers because they cannot do it simultaneously because there is a slightly different word structure and sentence structure that is used for ASL. However, both are pretty consistently used. And so the resources that I chose for this disability are both in Spanish, from Parent Center Hub and also hearit.org. These are resources both in Spanish that help give parents a first stepping stone to understand a little bit more about their child's disability, as well as um, things that they can do to assist their child. This is the resource from hearit.org. Um, there's just simply labeled pérdida de audición en niños, which is loss in hearing in children, and it gives some really basic information on symptoms of hearing loss, as well as other as well as definitions of very specific types of hearing loss for children, and also gives links to more information. And so that can be used by parents who speak Spanish, of course, to help their children. Presentation. I hope it has been educational and insightful, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.